Imagine opening an app and seeing a number next to every person you know. Your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors, even complete strangers. A number that claims to measure how much other people enjoy interacting with them. At first, it sounds useful, maybe even harmless. A shortcut, a better way to understand the people around you. But what happens when everyone can see it? What happens when that number becomes part of your identity? Part of your reputation? Part of every decision people make about you? This is the story of Affinity, a world where one simple score changed the way people met, worked, dated, and judged one another, and where a single number became more important than anyone expected. Affinity wasn't available to the public. It wasn't even available to most Vibe users. It began with a small group of people selected to test a new feature. One of them was Ethan Walker. At first, it looked like any other premium service. It was an invitation-only beta, exclusive, private, something designed for people who were already successful, who already had influence, who already had access. And like everyone else who received an invitation, Ethan was curious. By the time the beta program reached Vibe's leadership team, the results were difficult to ignore. Users weren't just trying Affinity, they were using it frequently, more than any other premium feature on the platform. The numbers kept climbing. Retention, engagement, daily check-ins, invitation acceptance. Every metric told the same story. People liked Affinity. The more users joined, the more valuable it became. And the more valuable it became, the more often people used it. For Vibe, that wasn't a warning sign. It was a success story. The beta had exceeded expectations. And people weren't asking whether Affinity worked. They were asking how soon they could get access. So the conversation shifted. Not whether Affinity should expand, but how. Some argued it should remain exclusive. Others saw an opportunity. If users loved the features this much, why give it away? Maybe Affinity wasn't just a successful beta. Maybe it was a product, a premium product, one people would willingly pay for. And if the pricing didn't work, they could always revisit that later. The risk seemed small. The potential seemed enormous. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it was close. And before long, Vibe had a plan. Affinity would leave the beta program, and for the first time, the public would get a chance to see their score. Affinity launched on a Tuesday morning. At first, most people didn't know what to make of it. A new premium feature, a monthly subscription, a promise to reveal how the world saw you. The announcement appeared everywhere, on phones, in coffee shops, at bus stops, in office break rooms. And almost everyone had the same reaction. What is this? The promotional page offered plenty of answers. See your score, understand your impact, discover how others see you. But those explanations only seemed to create more questions. A score based on what? Who was doing the scoring? How could an app possibly know how people perceived you? Group chats filled with speculation. Friends compared screenshots. People searched for explanations that didn't really exist yet. Most weren't convinced. Most weren't interested. Not yet. But they were curious. And curiosity has a way of spreading, especially when everyone around you is asking the same questions. It wasn't a trend, not yet. But for the first time, Affinity had everyone's attention. It started with a few posts. A screenshot here, a score there. People sharing their results simply because they could. Not celebrities or experts, just ordinary users trying something new. For the first time, Affinity scores were visible. Not the details behind them, just the number. And that was enough. The post spread quickly. Friends shared them, coworkers compared them. People began paying attention to the scores themselves. Not because they understood them, they didn't. But the numbers seemed important, meaningful, as though they measured something that everyone else wanted to know about them. The more people subscribed, the more people posted, the more scores appeared. And with every new screenshot, Affinity became a little more familiar, a little more normal. The conversation was beginning to change. Curiosity was giving way to comparison. And comparison has a way of creating its own momentum. Affinity still wasn't a necessity, but people were starting to wonder where they stood. Affinity was becoming harder to ignore. The scores were everywhere, in posts, in conversations, in comment sections. People talked about them as though they already understood what they meant. Most didn't, but that didn't seem to matter. The numbers kept spreading, and with every new screenshot, Affinity felt a little more familiar, a little more legitimate, a little more difficult to dismiss. Eventually, curiosity outweighed skepticism. For less than the cost of a monthly streaming subscription, anyone could see their score. And more people were deciding it was worth finding out. The process was simple. A few taps, a short confirmation, less than a minute from start to finish. Then the score appeared. No explanation, no context, just a number. Maya still didn't know what it meant, but now she knew hers. Affinity was impossible to miss. It sat at the top of Maya's feed. Every time she opened Vibe, it was there. The same score, the same number, waiting. Most days looked exactly the same as they always had. She visited museums, tried new coffee drinks, shared photos, checked in with friends. The same things millions of people posted every day. Nothing about it felt connected to Affinity. At least, not obviously. The score never explained itself. It didn't tell people what mattered. It didn't tell people what it measured. It simply existed. A number that followed them through the app. A number that occasionally changed. And one evening, Maya received a notification. Her score had increased. The change was small, almost insignificant, but it was enough to make her pause. Because if nothing had been different, why had the number moved? Affinity started appearing in conversations, not because people understood it. They didn't. The score changed, it went up, it went down, and most people had no idea why. Questions spread quickly. Answers were harder to find. Everyone seemed to have a theory. Engagement, consistency, positivity, reputation, helpful posts, time spent online. The explanations were different, sometimes contradictory, but that didn't stop people from discussing them. Theories began appearing online. Friends compared experiences, coworkers compared changes, strangers compared patterns. The score was becoming easier to talk about than to understand. And the more people talked about it, the more familiar it became. Not as a feature and not as an experiment, as a part of everyday life. Nobody knew how Affinity worked, but more people were talking about it every day. People weren't talking about Affinity because they understood it. They were talking about it because it kept surprising them. Some scores felt exactly right. Others didn't. A teacher everyone admired showed up as a 95. Nobody seemed shocked. A popular creator appeared as a 78. That raised a few eyebrows. Conversations weren't serious. Most of the time, people were simply comparing notes. A manager, a coworker, a friend, someone they followed online. Everyone seemed to know a score that felt higher than expected, or lower, or just strange. And the more examples people found, the more they wanted to discuss them. Not because the scores were changing their decisions. They were becoming part of the conversation. Affinity wasn't a novelty anymore. It was becoming a topic. As more scores became visible, certain patterns started attracting attention. Because some results felt familiar. The local volunteer who was always helping people. The teacher students seemed to love. The organizer who showed up for every community event. Again and again, people encountered scores that seemed to match their expectations. Not every score. Some still felt surprising, sparked debate, but others felt obvious. And those were the ones people remembered. the scores that confirmed what they already believed. No one could explain how Affinity worked, but more people were beginning to trust what it told them. Not because they had proof, because it felt accurate. Not every score confirmed what people already believed. Some did the opposite. A business owner known for supporting the community showed up lower than expected. People noticed, they questioned it, but the question sounded different now. It sounded less like doubt and more like explanation. Maybe there was something they didn't know. Maybe Affinity measured things they couldn't see. Maybe the number was seeing a bigger picture. That didn't mean everyone trusted it, but the conversations were shifting. When a score seemed right, people remembered it. When a score seemed wrong, people tried to explain it. And somewhere in the middle, Affinity gained a little more weight. The discussions continued in coffee shops, in bookstores, in community groups, and in private conversations between friends. Not every score made sense, but fewer people were questioning the system. As Affinity became more familiar, people started finding it easier to interpret. They were learning how to fit it into the stories they already told themselves. When a score matched someone's expectations, it felt meaningful. When it confirmed a first impression, it felt accurate. And when it aligned with a reputation that already existed, it felt obvious. People talked less about how Affinity worked, and more about what a score seemed to say about a person. A high score became evidence that someone was well liked. A lower score became evidence that something felt off. Not because the score explained those things, because it seemed to support what they already believed. The more often that happened, the easier it became to accept. The easier it became to repeat. And the easier it became to share with someone else. Affinity didn't tell people why someone had a score, but people used the score to tell a story that fit what they already believed. Affinity had started as a curiosity, something new, something people checked because everyone else was checking it. Then it became a conversation. People compared scores, discussed scores, tried to make sense of scores. Over time, those conversations became easier. A score didn't need an explanation. It didn't need context. Most of the time, it was simply accepted as another piece of information. Something people mentioned in passing. Something people referenced without even thinking. Something that quietly became part of everyday life. People didn't need to understand how Affinity worked. They only needed to believe it was usually right. And the more familiar it became, the less anyone questioned it. Affinity wasn't a trend anymore. Wasn't even a topic. It had become part of the language people used to talk about each other. Most people never noticed the change. It happened slowly, conversation by conversation, day by day, until one day it simply felt normal. And once something feels normal, people stop asking whether they should use it. They start asking how to use it better. The score had become part of everyday life. people checked it the same way they checked messages, the same way they checked the weather or the news. At first, most people were satisfied just knowing the number, but eventually a different question started to emerge. Not what their score was, but why it was. People looked through old posts, recent comments, photos, conversations, searching for something that might explain what they were seeing. Everyone seemed to have a theory. A volunteer event, a popular post, a positive comment, a busy weekend. Sometimes the explanation sounded convincing. Sometimes they didn't. But the story spread anyway. And every time someone pointed to a score change and claimed they knew the reason, a few more people started paying attention, looked for clues. People weren't asking what Affinity measured anymore. They were trying to figure out how it worked. The internet did what it always did. People found each other. Those who thought they had answers gathered in one place. Those looking for answers followed them there. Every theory came with examples. Some whose score had increased, some whose score had dropped, someone who was certain they had figured it out. And for every theory, there was someone else willing to agree. One person became 10, 10 became hundreds, hundreds became thousands. Before long, entire communities had formed around trying to understand Affinity. Some people tracked their scores, some kept notes, some built spreadsheets. Others simply shared their experiences and compared them with strangers. The details rarely matched. The conclusions often contradicted each other. But uncertainty rarely stopped people from explaining things. Theories spread, discussions grew, and the more often people encountered the same ideas, the more familiar those ideas began to feel. Before long, people weren't just sharing theories, they were building communities around them. People stopped guessing. They started testing. At first, the experiments were small. A different kind of post, a community event, a positive comment, a photo that seemed more likely to get attention. Then they watched and waited and checked their scores to see what happened. Some experiments lasted a day, others lasted weeks. People kept notes, tracked changes, compared results, looking for patterns that might explain the numbers. Not everyone approached it scientifically. Some conclusions were based on careful observation, others were based on a single coincidence. A score went up, a score went down, and someone decided they knew why. Soon, everyone had a method. Post more, post less, volunteer, share local events, avoid arguments, focus on positivity. The advice was everywhere. The problem was that the results rarely agreed. One person's success contradicted another person's failure. Theories multiplied faster than evidence, but the testing never really stopped. Because every new score change felt like another clue, another piece of the puzzle. People still didn't know what Affinity measured, but more and more of them became convinced that if they paid enough attention, they could figure it out. People didn't need proof. They only needed patterns, or at least what looked like patterns. Over time, certain ideas became more than theories. They became advice, and eventually they became habits. People started choosing different photos, different words, different versions of themselves, not because anyone told them to, not because Affinity required it, but because certain behaviors seemed to produce better results. A positive post felt safer than a negative one. A community event seemed more valuable than a complaint. A carefully chosen comment felt wiser than an argument. One decision rarely mattered, but thousands of small decisions began to add up. The platform slowly started to change. Not overnight, not all at once. The differences were subtle at first. A few more volunteer photos, a few more inspirational messages. Less messy moments, less unpopular opinions. Most people didn't notice it happening. They were too busy participating in it. And because no one was being forced to change, it hardly felt like change at all. People weren't trying to understand Affinity anymore. They were learning how to perform for it. The more people focused on Affinity, the more they wanted to improve it. And where there was demand, someone was always willing to supply answers. Guides appeared, videos, courses, consultants. Experts who promised they understood a system that nobody had actually seen. Some people were skeptical, but many weren't. After all, if a score could go up, then surely there had to be a way to make it happen. And if somebody had already figured it out, why not learn from them? Soon, people weren't just tracking their scores, they were celebrating them, comparing them, sharing them. A higher score felt like progress. A lower score felt like a setback. Little by little, the number stopped being information. It became an achievement. And once that happened, something else began to change. People stopped looking at Affinity as a measure of behavior. They started looking at it as a measure of people. A score was no longer just something you had, it was becoming something you were. And once that idea took hold, it wasn't long before people began using Affinity to decide who they trusted, who they listened to, and who they wanted to associate with. People had spent months trying to understand Affinity, trying to improve it, trying to learn what made a score rise or fall. Eventually, something changed. People stopped focusing on what the score meant and started focusing on what it said. A high score began to carry assumptions, not official or proven ones, just assumptions that felt true. Someone with a 94 seemed more trustworthy, more interesting, more desirable. Someone with a lower score often received a different reaction. Not anger or rejection, just a little less enthusiasm, a little less curiosity, a little less effort. Most people never realized they were doing it. The score had simply become part of the introduction, part of the first impression, part of the conversation. Before long, people were learning a number before they learned a name. And once that started happening, the score wasn't just describing social status, it was helping create it. For months, Affinity had lived inside Vibe. It was something people checked when they opened the app, something they talked about with friends, something they tried to understand. Then, it stopped being confined to Vibe. The company announced partnerships with other platforms, dating apps, professional networks, community groups, event pages. The score could now follow people almost anywhere they went online. For the first time, complete strangers could see an Affinity score before they knew anything else. Before a conversation, before a first impression, before a single word was exchanged. Most people would tell you they didn't think the score mattered. and many of them genuinely believed that. But when a number appeared beside a face, it was difficult to not notice. It was difficult not to compare, to not let it influence a decision. A profile with a higher score seemed a little more trustworthy, a little more appealing, a little more worth the effort. Not because anyone said it should, but because the number was there. And once people could see affinity everywhere, they started carrying assumptions with them everywhere too. The score was no longer confined to the people who knew you. It was completely public, visible to friends, strangers, to anyone curious enough to look. And once a number became public, it stopped belonging only to the people who knew you. It became something the world could interpret for itself. When affinity became public, something subtle began to happen. People started making choices with it. Not official choices or required choices, personal ones. A higher score made someone seem a little more interesting, a little more desirable, a little more worth getting to know. Most people would have insisted they weren't judging others by a number. And maybe they believed that. But when a score appeared beside a face, it became difficult to ignore, to not compare, to not let it influence a decision, a date, a conversation, an invitation. One person received the benefit of the doubt, another didn't. Not because anyone knew them better, because a number got there first. The score began speaking before the person had a chance to. Assumptions became explanations. Explanations became decisions. And decisions began shaping who was included, who was noticed, who was remembered. At first, the changes seemed small. A guest list here, a missed invitation there. It was easy to dismiss or justify. But social opportunities have a way of creating more opportunities. And when people started choosing who belonged based on a score, affinity stopped being a reflection of social status. It started determining it. At first, affinity shaped social decisions. Who people talked to, who they invited, who they wanted around. But over time, the score began appearing in places where the stakes were much higher. Job applications, rental inquiries, loan requests. Nobody announced that affinity would be used to make decisions. No landlord admitted to checking scores. No bank claimed a number determined approval. And yet, the pattern kept appearing. When two candidates seemed equally qualified, the higher score often got the benefit of the doubt. When two applicants looked similar on paper, one seemed just a little safer, a little more trustworthy, less risky. Most people couldn't prove affinity was responsible, but they couldn't completely ignore the possibility either. Someone didn't get the apartment. Someone else lost the job. Another person was denied the loan. Each individual case had an explanation, maybe even a reasonable one. But when the same explanation kept appearing over and over again, people started asking questions. Questions nobody could answer. Was affinity simply measuring social success? Or was it beginning to create it? The people with higher scores seemed to move through the world a little more easily. The people with lower scores seemed to encounter a few more closed doors. Not enough to make headlines, not enough to prove anything, just enough for people to notice. And once people began noticing the pattern, it became impossible to stop looking for it. As concerns grew, some people made a quiet choice. They stopped making their affinity scores available. Maybe they didn't subscribe. Maybe they disabled sharing. Maybe they simply decided a number didn't belong in every interaction. At first, that seemed reasonable, even expected. But by then, people had become accustomed to seeing the score, accustomed to comparing it, to letting it answer questions before they were asked. So when the number wasn't there, the absence became noticeable. And once it became noticeable, people began drawing conclusions. Why wasn't it available? Was the score low? Was there something they didn't want others to see? No one knew, but certainty was never required. The missing score became a signal of its own. Profiles without scores attracted attention. Conversations without scores raised questions. People who had once been judged by a number were now judged by the absence of one. The score itself mattered less than the expectation that it should exist. People once worried about someone having a low score. Now they worried about someone having no score at all. Not knowing someone's score started to feel stranger than knowing it. As affinity became more and more normalized, criticism became harder to ignore. Videos questioned whether the score was helping people connect, or simply teaching them how to judge each other faster. Podcasts debated whether a number could ever capture something as complicated as trust, friendship, or character. Online discussions became increasingly divided. Some argued that affinity had made social life easier. Others wondered whether it had made social life shallower. For every story about someone finding new friends because of affinity, there was another story about someone being overlooked because of it. The debate was no longer about whether affinity worked. Almost everyone agreed that it did. The question was whether it was helping, or whether it had quietly become a barrier between people. Some saw affinity as a problem, while others saw it as progress. Some believed the score encouraged unfair assumptions. Others argued it simply gave people information they were already looking for. And despite all the criticism, most people kept using it. They checked scores before accepting invitations, before replying to messages, before deciding who to trust. The arguments grew louder, the headlines became more frequent, the opinions became stronger. But everyday life continued much as it always had. By then, people had strong opinions about affinity, but very few imagined a world without it. Even as criticism grew, affinity continued expanding. The company behind the platform saw the controversy differently than its critics did. People weren't leaving. Usage was increasing. Engagement was growing. From the company's perspective, affinity wasn't becoming less important. It was becoming essential. So they introduced a new feature, Affinity Connect, a tool designed to help users discover people, events, and opportunities around them. For the first time, people could see nearby affinity users on a live map. Not friends, not followers, not people they already knew. Complete strangers. A profile picture, a first name, a score, and a location, all visible with a single glance. The company described it as a way to expand social circles and encourage new connections, and many people embraced it immediately. Someone sitting across a coffee shop was no longer simply another customer. They were an A94, or an A87, or an A72. The score often appeared before the introduction, before the conversation, before the handshake, before people had the chance to decide for themselves what they thought of someone. Affinity was no longer just a social platform. It had become a way to navigate the world. People used it to find events, to meet new friends, to discover professional opportunities, to decide where they wanted to spend their time and who they wanted to spend it with. High scores carried a kind of social gravity. People noticed them, talked about them, sought them out, not because anyone told them to, but simply because the information was available. And because, over time, checking had become second nature. Affinity wasn't just something people checked anymore. It had become something they carried with them, something they expected to be there, woven into everyday life. It started like any other outage. A strange message, a missing score, a screen that refused to load. At first, most people assumed it would be fixed quickly. Apps went down all the time. Features glitched, servers failed. Everyone refreshed and waited, but the score stayed unavailable. Dating profiles showed nothing. Professional profiles showed nothing. Affinity Connect showed an empty map. No nearby users, no scores, no shortcut. As the hours passed, uncertainty began to creep in. People tried to remember numbers they had never expected to forget. Was she an A90? An A70? Had he been high enough to trust? Had they checked before? For the first time in years, people couldn't rely on Affinity to guide them. The outage didn't remove their ability to make decisions. It removed the information they had come to depend on. And what surprised people most wasn't that Affinity had gone down. It was how difficult it suddenly felt to function without it. 3 days after the outage began, the company finally addressed the public. A critical system failure had damaged Affinity's infrastructure. Despite extensive recovery efforts, the data remained inaccessible. The company promised it would rebuild the platform as quickly as possible. At first, many people assumed that meant everything would eventually return. The scores, the rankings, the history, the information they had spent years accumulating. But as more details emerged, a different reality began to take shape. The system could be rebuilt. The data could not. People began asking questions. What had their score been? What had everyone else's score been? Hadn't they taken a screenshot somewhere? Didn't a friend remember? Social media filled with people trying to reconstruct numbers from memory. Arguments broke out over scores that no longer existed. Some treated the loss like years of work had vanished overnight. People searched old photos, old messages, old posts, anything that might preserve a record of the score they once had. And it wasn't just their own scores they missed. They missed everyone else's too. The person they matched with last week, the applicant they almost hired, the acquaintance they had been considering inviting somewhere. Suddenly, information that had always seemed permanent was gone. For years, people had treated Affinity as a reflection of who someone was. Now they were trying to remember numbers that no longer existed, as though the score mattered more than the person that it belonged to. At first, life without Affinity felt uncomfortable. People had grown used to having answers, or at least the appearance of having answers. Without a score, even simple decisions suddenly felt uncertain. Who should you trust? Who should you hire? Who should you spend your time getting to know? For a while, many people found themselves hesitating, looking for information that wasn't there anymore, trying to make choices without the shortcut they had relied on for years. Decisions took longer. Conversations felt less predictable. People had to rely on their own judgment again. And for some, that was surprisingly difficult. But little by little, something began to change. People started asking questions they once left to Affinity. Questions about interests, experiences, goals, personality. Questions that couldn't be answered by a number. Some conversations lasted longer than expected. Some friendships formed where they otherwise never would have. Some dates turned out better than anyone anticipated. And some opportunities came for people who might never have been chosen before. The uncertainty never completely disappeared, but it became easier to live with. Because uncertainty wasn't a flaw in human relationships. It was part of them. And over time, many people discovered something unexpected. Some of the people they enjoyed the most were people they might never have chosen before. Nearly a year after the outage, Affinity was ready to return. The company called it Affinity 2.0, a complete rebuild. More reliable, more secure, more sophisticated. The result of thousands of hours of work. The engineers had solved the technical problems, the backups were stronger, the infrastructure was stronger, the safeguards were stronger. In almost every way, it was a better product than the one that came before it. And yet, the reaction was quieter than anyone expected. Most people weren't angry, they weren't protesting, they weren't demanding answers. Many simply looked at the announcement and moved on with their day. During Affinity's absence, people had adapted. They had made decisions without a score. They had hired people without rankings. They had gone on dates without knowing where someone stood. They had started conversations without checking a number first. Some had formed friendships they might never have pursued. Others discovered opportunities they might never have considered. And some of the people they enjoyed the most were the people they might never have chosen before. Inside the company, the debates began almost immediately. Some argued that Affinity should have returned sooner. Others argued that rebuilding it correctly had simply taken time. But the problem wasn't the timing, and it wasn't the technology. The world they had built Affinity for no longer existed, because while the company was rebuilding the platform, people were rebuilding something else. Their ability to make decisions for themselves. A score could be useful, sometimes even helpful, but it could never tell the whole story. And for the first time in years, people seemed comfortable discovering the rest for themselves. Affinity is a work of fiction, but the questions it asks are very real. Throughout this story, people slowly began outsourcing human judgment to a number. Not because they were forced to, because it was useful, convenient, easy. And when that number disappeared, they discovered something they had forgotten. Every number tells us something, but no number tells us everything. So here's the question. If Affinity existed in the real world, Would you use it? And if you did, would you know when you started relying on it too much? Let me know what you think in the comments. And remember, this was just one possibility.
I came like a seed in frost, small hands, open sky. You look through my quiet face like morning through glass. I learned your name as a light held